Welcome along, my aspiring allies, and thank you for joining me on this most recent episode of the Speaking of Inclusion podcast. Today, I am joined by Cath Blayney, and Cath is a liberation coach for Black and Brown leaders and also an allyship coach for white coaches, consultants, and healers. And she breaks down in our conversation today what the difference is in the way that she works with people. And we really did, unsurprisingly, get really into the topic of racialization, race, and racism. We talked all about the way in which she likes to assist people and support people in creating not spaces, but the capacity within ourselves as people to show up as safe for one another. And this is a personal favorite of mine. And I knew it was going to be coming into this because Cath and I met through very interesting circumstances when she approached me and called me in on some of my own behaviors. And I felt in the true spirit of the Speaking of Inclusion podcast, this was definitely something I needed to stay true to and share with you because this is for my personal learning as well as for yours. So this is me being raw and vulnerable and sharing my mistakes so that we can all grow together. And I will always be truly grateful for Cath for stepping up and helping me with that part of my journey. So without further ado, you know the drill. Please sit back, relax, and get comfortable in whichever way works best for you. And please welcome Cath Blayney to the Speaking of Inclusion podcast. So Cath Blayney, welcome to the Speaking of Inclusion podcast. So as I was just saying, you and we came into each other's orbit in a very different way than what I would normally meet my podcast guests. So normally the process is I kind of have conversations with people first, and I think, oh, this would be a really good conversation. Let's do it again and record it. And yet with you so very generously, I think we were already connected on LinkedIn, weren't we?
Yeah, we were.
And you very generously called me in on something that I was doing on LinkedIn. And you did it in such a brilliant way. And it gave me such a good opportunity to learn and grow that I thought actually in the spirit of everything that I learned from our conversation afterwards, I knew immediately you were going to be a fantastic guest. That had to happen. And B, in the spirit of everything I say I stand for, in my business and on the podcast, there was learning that I went through that I thought, yeah, I have to role model the sharing of this because I think this is also important. So I guess that's my feeling of how we came into it. Is that how you experienced it as well, or have you got a different take that you want to drop on me?
No, not at all. That's how I experienced it as well. And yeah, really excited for this conversation and happy to be here. So yeah, it's going to be a
Excellent.
good one.
So for everyone listening and watching, that's the positioning. And this is also my opportunity now to share my cock-ups, and that Cath has very beautifully helped me with. But now I'm going to do my standard thing, which is say, so now enough about me for a minute. I want to talk about you. So how did you arrive at where you've arrived at doing the work that you do? Because I know that everybody has a story and nobody just woke up one day thinking, oh, I'm going to do this. So what
Yeah,
drew
it's
you
been a
to your work?
journey actually. So I've been coaching for a good few years now, and my background's in education. So I originally started coaching head teachers, burnout, overwhelm, it's very real. And then since then, it's kind of evolved into some anti-racism work. So I started exploring anti-racism in schools. And actually, I still feel really passionately about it because I feel like the learning has to start there because so many people get to their 20s, 30s, 40s, and something happens and we think, oh, why is this the first time I'm hearing about it as an adult? And so getting it into our schools is really important. But it's also evolved as, there are leaders, there are business owners, there are people who are navigating a world where there are systems of oppression, but they're not aware of them and they don't know how to hold it. And so my work now is focused on, how do we create people who can be really confident and empowered by their racial identity and also use that to empower others. And that means that I work with people from all different hues. Sometimes my work is about allyship. So, as a white-bodied person, how can you hold that space? How can you be a safe person? And I know that we'll talk more about safe people as we go through the podcast. but also for Black and brown bodied leaders and business owners. How do you navigate these systems in the workplace, in your business? Because what we know is that these things show up. So we hold that in our bodies. And whether it's about being visible or speaking up, there's something in us that says, no, that's not for you, or no, you can't do that, or no, we can't have those conversations. And so, yeah, my work is centered around my own experience, because as a mixed heritage person, I have gone through the identity process of my whiteness and my blackness. So I feel like I've been on that journey on both sides, which then means that I can hold people through that journey as well. And, I try my best to do it without guilt and shame. And that's not to say that, there is shame, there is guilt, and it's not that I don't view those as negative. Actually, they're guides. We feel them, we hold space for them, and then we get to say, I'm going to take action. I'm going to release that because that's not mine to carry. And then I can take action that works and that serves me and other people. And so, yeah, I do a lot of identity work. I do a lot of regulation work. I do it in businesses and organizations. But when you find the right people who are really committed and heart-led, and there's so many people out there, aren't there, that just really want to do the right thing, but they don't have that space to get it wrong or to say, oh, I don't know the answer to this question, please help me. And so they end up doing nothing and saying nothing. And so one of my parts of my business is, how can we create a space where people can ask those questions, where they can, be vulnerable and be honest and not feel that they're going to be judged or shamed by people in the space. So that's where I'm at in my business at the moment, and it's really exciting. And that's me.
Yeah, and I mean, I absolutely love that you're doing all of this and there's so much that you've said in there, so many elements to unpack, I think, for us to really kind of get our heads around it, for anyone that's listening, thinking, geez, that sounds amazingly interesting and also a little bit scary when it comes to engaging in the work that way. And I love that you talk a lot about holding space, so kind of creating that space where people can show up as who they are, with their own experiences to date or their own belief systems to date. We don't have to course correct at that point. It's about being really honest and assessing, well, what's our starting point, and then stepping off from there, rather than coming in thinking, I should know this. I'm supposed to know this. Am I supposed to know this? And then we look at each other going, oh, maybe you know this and I don't know this, and I'm not going to say anything then. And I love that you are, creating that space. Now, you mentioned there, and this is something I really want to get into early, because I think this for me was also one of the moments where I was like, oh, you are gold in the way you've just positioned this, where you talk about safe people. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people who talk about safe spaces. You go into a new space and they're like, this is a safe space, come as you are. And I feel that that is quite harmful, because no, we can't guarantee that safety in a space. At any given moment, wherever you are, things can change really quickly. People can be unpredictable. You don't know what they're bringing. You don't know what they're thinking, how their day's gone. And so I always talk about safe people. And there's two parts to that. It's, how do you find safety in yourself? And lots of us walk around and we aren't feeling safe in ourselves. We do have our own trauma. We do carry beliefs that don't serve us. How can we find that safety in ourselves? Because once we do that, we can then hold space for others. We can then carry lived experiences. We can understand other people's perspectives. But if we haven't done that work on ourselves to become that safe person, then it's really hard to be able to create safety for other people. And so if we imagine in an organization, instead of declaring a safe space, if there's a room full of 20 people and those people are all safe, then everyone feels like they can say and challenge. But it also isn't this, it has to be perfect. Because when someone, if it's, especially if it's a leader that's saying this is a safe space, it becomes really hard to challenge them. So if you're a person in that space who then feels that there's been some harm, but everybody's acting like the space is safe and everything's fine, it becomes another barrier to challenging and to actually being honest about how you experience that space. And so I think to say to people, I want to be a safe person for you, doesn't mean we get it right all the time. It doesn't mean that you declare yourself a safe person and that's it, you just are. It's something that is ongoing. It's actual work that we have to do on the self. It's something that's never finished, because at any moment we can be activated by something that we thought we might have dealt with. We can be, something might throw us off course. We might not be having the best day. And so it's, what tools do we have? What do we do to help ourselves to be regulated so that we can speak with kindness and compassion, and also honesty and vulnerability? Because especially in organizations, if we don't have those difficult conversations, if we can't hold ourselves through them, then how can we hold other people through them? And so whenever I hear that term safe space, I'm like, oh no, don't say that. Don't say that, because that can be really harmful. And even though it's done with the best of intentions, I feel like it's become this buzzword that people say, but there's not actually anything underneath it. And so my work is about, underneath a safe space, actually it's safe people. It's how do we regulate ourselves? How do we show up? How do we speak our truth? And sometimes we can be in an unsafe place and still be a safe person for ourselves. And we get to navigate, do I want to be in this space? And if the answer is yes, then we get to find that safety within ourselves, and not have to like bend and flex and mold to suit the expectations of the space. But actually, we just get to sit in ourselves and who we are, and to still speak our truth, even if it's not received well, even if our voice shakes, all of those things. And so, yeah, that's part of the work that I do. I really think safe people is the goal.
Yeah. And I want to kind of leave a minute for people to let that settle,
Mm.
because for me that was one of the most profound things. It's so, I mean, don't get me wrong, what you have just positioned there in its core is so simple, but it's so profound. And for me it was one of those moments where literally the light bulb went off above my head when you said that to me, and I was like, of course, of course, that makes way more sense. That actually, if we do with the whole point of when we talk about safe spaces, in an ideal world, what we're talking about are people that do the work, and
Mm.
people that continually recognize, like as everything that you just said, that there's no definition of done. It's always about showing up as best we can with what we've got on any given day. And and yeah, and actually by proxy, if we're all doing that, the likelihood is the space will be as safe as it's going to be on any given day.
Yeah.
And it's kind of nonsensical when I play it back now in my head. I'm like, oh yeah, we talk about safe spaces. I mean, really, like that's trip hazards, right? Or that's like, sharp things sticking out the wall. Like that's a safe, like that's the
Yeah.
space is safe when we know there's, we're not going to fall into a pit of snakes or something. Like when you're giving it Indiana Jones vibes, right? So like that's safe. And actually, yeah, when we are talking about the creation of safety and safeness, um that is wholly reliant on the people that are in the room. So when, as soon as you said no, it's about the people, I thought, you've nailed it, love. Like it is exactly that. And for my wonderful listeners, this is the thing exactly that Cath called me in on, um which is when I was putting something out on LinkedIn about spaces that I was trying to create. And I kind of made a blanket statement. And I think this is probably a nice moment to also call out. We can recognize our intentions going into something, and we have to recognize the impact it has on a wider audience or an other person, right? And whilst my intention was to signal safety of a group that I was part of, Kath quite rightly contacted me, and the reason I say called in and not called out is she sent me a DM and just said, here's some, seen your post, here's something I've observed, are you open to a chat about this? And there are, you, because you could have come into my comments quite happily and just said, look, hey, here's you talking about, this being a safe space, there's an absolute absence of black and brown bodies in your space, are you sure?
Mm.
And that would have been perfectly valid, like it was a perfect um observation to make. But the way that you did it is you were also acting in a safe person for me by bringing it to me in a way that opened up a dialogue for me, rather than me having, I mean, and we can talk about the fact that I also sensed my own defensiveness when we had that conversation, but you opened it up in a way that allowed and enabled learning and dialogue. And I think, and then when you positioned the whole, actually let's talk about safety and safe spaces versus safe people, and I was like, yes, that makes complete sense.
Mm.
That's
And I
actually
think
what we're looking for. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's that thing. I always question when people jump into the comments. I think there is a time and a place for it, but I always think about the motivation behind it. Like, are you trying to shame that person?
Mm.
Are you trying to, you know, share a different perspective, which you have every right to do? But for me, part of being a safe person is that I have these conversations without being attached to what happens next. And I feel like in the comments, you kind of you're attached to what happens next. You want a kind of public apology. You want people to think that you're this or that, or that you've got some sort of
Yeah.
superiority. Whereas actually in the DMs, I can say what I think, and whatever people choose to do with that is up to them, and I'm not attached to their action or their inaction. And so it's always one of those things, I'm here for comments and I'm here for disagreement in the comments, but I always have that lens of, are we doing it with compassion? Are we doing it for the right reasons? And sometimes it's important for these conversations to be played out so that people can see. But for me, calling out, it happens if I'm in a space where harm is being caused right now. So if I'm in a space and someone is causing harm, I'm not going to wait for the harm to be finished and then have a conversation with them. That for me is a signal to, this needs dealing with right now in
Yeah.
this moment. And then there are other times where, it's out there. The post was out there. It didn't matter whether I commented, I did it now, I did it tomorrow. You know, you can do that more gently with compassion. And I think that there's a
Yeah.
space for both. And it comes again from doing the work on the self. Like when I saw the post, I obviously had a reaction. And it's being aware of that and thinking, okay, there's no black and brown people in this photo. I'm questioning that. I'm thinking, and I know because I've followed you for a while, I know that inclusion is part of who you are. I know that you're committed to it. And so you make that decision, is it worth scrolling by and forgetting about it? Because, there's plenty on social media at the moment that is
Mm.
appropriate for. But is it also worth having a conversation? And, I'm really glad that I did, because I think the conversation, both that we had after it and this one, is so powerful and so important. And this is how we create more awareness, not by me, trolling you in the comments. This is how we talk about it in a way that, there's a level playing field. We get to say what we think, even if it's not the same. And we get to do it in a way that's safe and is in the intentions are good and
Yeah.
not to shame or make people feel guilty.
Yeah. And actually and again, thank you to you for doing it and for doing it in that way, because I would like to believe that, like exactly you said, this has led to the best possible outcomes for all involved, actually. And actually we're turning it into something productive now, in that I could have, I would like to believe I could have done this learning in a similar way publicly if you'd have done it that way in the comments. I mean, of course I want to believe that, but who knows, right? We don't know. And I feel like we've arrived at it in a way that I'm like, we can share this as an opportunity for learning for myself and for others. And I think that's so important. And I really like the way that you described that then, about thinking about your motivation for it, um and kind of like, oh God, I've got menopause brain now. Oh yeah, that was it. Not being attached to the outcomes. That was the phrase that you used, wasn't it? In that actually I feel strongly enough about this that I would like to say something. And actually, and you use the phrase that you action or inaction as a result of that. And it's like, it's not on me to decide how you're going to respond to this. It's on me to kind of position the thing that I'm thinking and feeling, and then it's over to you. And that's like that, the feedback in its truest form in that thing, isn't it? It's like, here's something and it's up to you to take it forward or not, whatever. And it genuinely was up to me to be like, well, I can engage with this, or I can just say thanks but no thanks, like. And I trust as well that if I'd have gone in a different direction and basically said, oh, thank you for your feedback, that you'd have just been like, well, fair enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's, when I work with organizations, I remember I was working with someone last year and someone came up to me after like the first session that we'd had together and they were like, but Cath, how do you convince people that they need to do this? And my response was always, it's not your job to convince them. It's not your job to convince them. It's your job to learn, to speak your truth. And then whatever happens after that, that's not the work. And
Yep.
I think we live in a society where it is about other people's reactions and responses. We do people please, we do want to look good, we don't want to get cancelled, and so that becomes the driver for what we do. And the risk of that is that you end up staying silent because you're too scared about what people think, or that you end up layering this tokenism over the top. I've done this unconscious bias training, so now I don't need to do anything, because on the outside it looks like we're doing the work, but
Mm.
actually inside we've still got, microaggressions happening daily, denial, othering, all of the things that it's almost that grey area in organizations. It's not interpersonal interactions. It's not the overt stuff. It's the bits that are deniable. It's the things that people can overlook. And that's where the work is. And I think when
Yep.
people detach themselves, they actually confront the real work rather than, layering on top, because it just feels like, oh yeah, we can do this and tick that box. And if anybody asks, we've got an EDI department and we do this and we've got this policy, but actually it's, what are the people, what is that experience of someone walking in through your door?
Yeah.
From a marginalised group. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And how does that compare to people who do have that proximity to privilege? And lots of people are a bit afraid to ask that question. And, part of the work that I do, it's about doing it in a way that has compassion. It's not about that shame and guilt. I'm not going to stand there and be like, you should be doing this and you have to do this. And, it's, I'll share my knowledge. And then what I love is when organizations say, well, this is how it fits into our work, and this is that gap. And I've seen this. And you actually start to create their own journey, because when they do that, when you leave, they know how to navigate things still. Whereas if I go in and say, do these things and have this policy, I'll leave and, the work will get lost.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It's critical on your presence being there to be a guide rather than them um like really understanding the how did we get here, and having a bit of an internal framework of like being able to pause and reflect and think, well, hang on, what was it that Cath said? So I'm feeling this thing. How do I just notice that, and maybe I'll take a minute and
yeah.
put those skills into action for themselves. Again, like you said, with no need for perfection, in recognizing, as with anything, because we're learning a new skill, right? When we're learning about different ways to regulate our emotions, or we're learning, how maybe not to react or respond, or it takes practice.
Mm.
And it's not something that people, I certainly don't think people can expect to just be like, oh, well, Cath told me this and therefore I shall do this from now on. Like, it's
Mm.
not, because if it was that easy, we'd have fixed a whole host of problems way before 2026, right? we'd have
Yeah,
we'd have done it. We would have got further.
yeah, it's so true. And I think, it's so important that we all take that individual responsibility. I think that it's so easy to be like, well, I can't make a change. Like, I'm just one person in this huge world. But actually, if we all take little steps, if we all do like one thing and improve every day, rather than these big gestures, or, only learning about Black history during Black History Month, and then for the other 11 months it's like, oh, let's ignore it. And it's those things that help you to build the foundations. And I think that is the foundations are what makes the experience much more positive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's future skills as well, isn't it? Because also this internal learning, this kind of shifting of perspective and understanding, like, it doesn't happen in a vacuum either. Like, once we start to crack that door ajar a little bit, we see other things, and we see other, we see more play out. We recognize more in ourselves and in other people. And it's almost like you get a bigger sense of what the jigsaw picture could be for you.
Mm.
And you can apply that thinking to other scenarios and other situations and other conversations. And certainly from my perspective, it's only something that keeps adding benefit. Like, the further you go down that road, the easier it becomes to maybe catch yourself and question, like, hang on, how did I respond in that moment? Even when you've done the response, you can still have opportunity to go, hang on a minute, what was going on for me there? Do I
Yeah,
need to rethink that? Yeah. And we get to be then still in control of our own responses and things going forward.
yeah,
And it plays out in all aspects of life.
yeah. And the work that I do it through a trauma-informed lens. And so I believe that all of our experiences are held in our body. And what often happens when I start these work with people who are committed to being allies is that their racialized trauma, what they hold in their bodies to do with race and racism, impacts how they react to things. And a common one that I hear is, well, we didn't speak about race and racism when I was growing up. And that's held somewhere in your body, that fear of talking about race is held.
Yeah.
And so when someone comes to you and tries to start the conversation, that part of you is activated and you're like, no, don't do that. Your brain goes into survival mode and it's not safe. Whoever, one of your caregivers said to you, we don't talk about that, and brushed something under the carpet. And in that moment as a child, you were programmed not to talk about race. And so when someone tries to open that up as a conversation as an adult, your body goes into shutdown mode. And that's when we often get fragility and defensiveness. And, we can't make progress unless we open those channels of communication. And sometimes we have to go back in order to go forward. We have to deal with that experience. And it's not just in our own lived experience, whether we're white, black, or brown bodied. Obviously, the lived experience of racism looks very different, but also we carry things historically, genetically, and when we go back, but we also go further back and we think, what were our ancestors doing? And if you're a white bodied person and you go back into history, then actually that is where that guilt and shame comes from, because you're not proud of your white body. And this is the piece when I talk about racial identity, if we all got to the point where we were proud of our race, the world would be a much better place. The liberation in that moment, but we don't describe ourselves as white because there's often a conversation that makes us feel guilty or shame or discomfort around it. And so, if we can feel empowered by that, if we can think, yeah, that was then, but that's not mine to carry now because that's not me. And in my life, in this present moment, I get to do this. I get to disrupt the system. I get to challenge. I get to take care of people. Then you get to a point where it's like, this is great. This is what I can control. These are the actions that I can take. And that is a really powerful place to be. And I think not enough people do that identity work in order to reach that point where they feel really empowered, regardless of the hue of their skin.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we've mentioned several times now as well around shame and guilt, and I've kind of got my own interpretation of what those terms as emotions mean. How do you see them manifesting?
In terms of behavior or terms internally?
Oh, let's say both.
Okay. So for me, when I do work, I don't view emotions as positive or negative. And often when people hear anger or shame or guilt, instantly they're like, oh, that's bad. We've got to, like, don't talk about that. Don't feel that. Put that in a little box. Whereas emotions for me are data, it's information. Where did that feeling come from? And what can we take from that in order to move forwards and to actually take action that's aligned with who we are or what we're trying to do? Because ultimately, guilt doesn't serve us. It doesn't serve us. It's important to acknowledge it, to feel it, to know where it came from, and then we get to release it. And I think lots of people feel disempowered, that actually it's too hard. It feels like this big thing. Whereas actually, when we become safe people and we've done that identity work, we notice it, we become aware of it, we say, oh, hey, thanks for that. This is mine to carry, this is mine to take forward. That's not mine, I get to release it. And it's the same with shame. Another phrase that I hear all the time is let's leave shame at the door. And it's like, no, let's welcome shame in. Let's see what that's trying to tell us. Let's see what that is actually becoming a barrier to. Because if we don't deal with it, then that barrier is going to stay in place. So let's welcome all of our emotions, all of our feelings, and let's not apologize for them, but let's use it in a way that can serve us and can serve other people as well. But I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
No, I think that's fantastic. I mean, I'm certainly, like anyone that's watching on YouTube, I was like nodding away like mad with this, because I'm in complete agreement with you in that emotions are just emotions and feelings, they're just things, they're fleeting, they are and I've even used exactly that, like emotions are data, like it's just your body giving you information, and I think we should be paying attention to it. And I absolutely have my own beliefs around the labels of things being good or bad, just generally, even in terms of am I a good person or a bad person. Like, it's such nonsense. How the measures that we use to do that, it's just stories that we make up about ourselves or about other people, because no one is inherently good or bad. Like, we're just people trying to do the best we can, and yet we make these, yeah, measures and judgments of each other, and it's almost as if like you have to constantly be striving to be good. And it's like, well, sure, yeah, it'd be nice to not be awful to one another, but actually, is that the measure I want to use? Or as you said, should I really just be tuning into what's going on for me. What am I bringing today? What's my energy bringing? What's my mindset bringing? Like, how am I arriving? And am I happy with that? Am I satisfied that that's the energy I want to be giving in the space today? Or would I like the opportunity to maybe take a minute and do something about that and do something different? And obviously that's difficult because 9 times out of 10, if I'm someone who has to commute and I've had a bit of road rage that morning, I'm probably going to bring that into work with me. Or, likewise, if I've had a fantastic morning, if the kids put their shoes on, brush their teeth and everything without having to say, put your shoes on, put your shoes on, 1,000 times, like, probably going to be feeling quite good about myself, you know.
Yeah.
And all of those things are fantastic and they are fleeting. And it's interesting with the shame and the guilt thing. I don't know if I read it somewhere or if someone told me it, and I'm now annoyed that I can't remember. But someone once positioned shame and guilt to me as shame being kind of a version of guilt, but it's almost like you're trying to hide it. When you're ashamed of something, it's you're experiencing kind of that guilty emotion, but you don't want anyone to see it and you don't want to acknowledge it for yourself, and it's just kind of very internalized. And whereas kind of guilt is something that we can actually maybe acknowledge a little bit more, acknowledge our guilt of something, and it doesn't necessarily have to have the internalized hidden attachment to it. It's just like, I can feel guilty about this and I can talk about feeling guilty about this. But then now I'm questioning that. I think, well, I can say that about, oh, I feel ashamed about that. But it does, but for me, they do carry slightly different energies.
Yeah, they do. They do. It's almost like shame is much more linked to you as a person, your identity that you're hiding, like you say, that hiding of it. Whereas guilt feels a little bit lighter, like it's a bit further away from who we are. I think when we're ashamed of something, we think that it says something about us. It says something about who we are, whether we're a good person, and what does that mean? Because
Yeah,
good in the classroom means you sit still, you're quiet. Yeah, it's what does good even mean? We're conditioned in these words of like good and
yeah,
professional, and actually when we unpack what those expectations are around that, we're like, oh, actually
yeah,
that doesn't speak to individual identity. That's not inclusive. That's just this usually Eurocentric expectation that people are made to conform with. And so if we can detach that, and again, it's that work of you can be a kind person and still uphold racism. It's not about good and bad, it's about individuals. And quite often, that moment where people realize that they're upholding a system and, we're all racist unless we're doing the work. And even then, we probably still are. It's that, well, I can't be racist because we've attached so much to that word, so much shame to the
yeah,
word racist and racism, that actually when we then start to associate it with ourselves, we go into protective mode. No, 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 that's not me. And we try and detach ourselves from it, because otherwise the shame of that feels much more powerful than anything else that wants to do better and to kind of get the work done. So yeah,
yeah,
shame is something that we absolutely have to deal with and confront, because it is a huge barrier to actually doing the work and being inclusive.
yeah, definitely. Excellent. I'm glad we got to kind of unpack that a little bit. And actually, something you've started to allude to there as well, around when we think about what is, we've talked about kind of being racialized, right? Because so, and share with me if you have a different perspective, or correct me if I'm completely wrong. But from my perspective, race is a social construct, right? The way we are racialized is a completely made up, again, Eurocentric system of policing bodies, right?
Yeah.
So, and yet it absolutely shapes and influences all of the structures and systems that we all go about our daily lives with. So we can acknowledge it's made up, and we can acknowledge it has absolutely real world impact.
Yeah.
And you've started to kind of talk there about I'm going to go with triggering is probably the best word, because it is a triggering conversation topic. Like I say, just even the word racist, like, you easily, and I will include myself in this, we can get triggered from one, like 0 to 100, and make just the idea that could be attached to us as a human, right? Most people are going to struggle with that. So how do you kind of introduce that as a conversation to people. I'm thinking in my head, I'm thinking specifically about people racialized as white, but I obviously recognize that everybody is capable of engaging in racist behaviors, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I first work with people, we often talk about racial identity, and Janet Helms has a great model with 6 different phases of racial identity development. And it's that idea of, often there is color blindness. Like many people go through that phase and are still in that phase of, I don't see color, all lives matter. And they think that that is a positive thing. And going through these different stages, and it's not linear, so you can jump from one to another. And often there are moments when our eyes are opened and you can't ignore it, but then it's in that moment, what do you choose to do with it? And I think the work that I do is centered around, going back into your own racialized experiences. What did you learn about it? What do you need to keep hold of? What do you need to let go of that's not yours? And when we can start to regulate ourselves, so I do a lot of mindset, nervous system regulation work. I tap. So I'm here for kind of connecting the mind and the body, because you can tell your mind, do this, do that, but unless your body really believes it, and unless your body has the capacity to take action, then it becomes really hard and we start shrinking and staying silent. And so for me, it's a capacity thing. It's, how much have we delved into our own identity, historically, our lived experience? How much have we then learned about the experiences of others who don't look like us? Because when we start to understand what that really looks like in terms of the systems, how we see that play out in our institutions, in education, in our schools, when we start to see through that lens, you can't unsee it. And I think there's so many people who have kind of dipped into the work and seen a little bit and then gone back into, oh, it feels maybe a bit too uncomfortable, and they haven't confronted it. And so in the work that I do, it's about, how can we embrace that part of us, that heart-led part of us that really wants to do better? How can that become bigger than the fear of getting it wrong, the fear of the shame, the guilt, and all of those things? And so for me, it's always about the identity piece. It's always about that awareness. And like you were saying, something happens and you think, well, where am I feeling that in my body? I'm reacting to that. Why am I reacting to that? This is how I want to show up. But obviously, usually our dysregulation stops us from doing that. And so it's about the tools. And anyone that's done identity work in any other area will know it's about how do we use those tools, because they're not, racial identity isn't separate from your identity. It's a part of it. But all the tools that we would use to regulate ourselves, we can use that for our racial identity as well, and that can help us to show up. And yes, there's an important part of it that's about knowledge and it's about understanding of those systems, but there's a bigger part of it that is, who am I and how do I show up in a way that I can be a leader in this work, and that I can set an example, and that I can disrupt and change a system that I don't believe in, that I can see as unjust. And yeah, it's making up that bigger than the fear that is just such an important part of all of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you're explaining that, I'm kind of thinking, well, to me, this obviously just makes a lot of sense. And then I'm trying to overlay that with, okay, but it's only, or maybe only is not the right word, but it's more likely to make a lot of sense to people that are willing, like you say, heart-led perhaps, or just willing to want to engage with that level of discomfort in the first place, right? And like you've already said, we're not about convincing people or forcing people, like, because no one's ever going to want anything, right? If we're forced into something, the learning won't stick, the habit won't take, like, we know that. But you have to want to engage, don't you, in this conversation, right?
You do. And unfortunately, I think that often it takes something big for people to say, we need to do this work. We want to do this work. So whether that's something global, George Floyd's murder made people go, oh, we actually need to do some work here, or whether it's something internal in the organization. So quite often I work with organizations where something's happened. And what I would love is, how do we get to a point where people see the importance of this work before harm is caused, or before the greatest harm is caused? And I think that it's conversations like this, building that awareness that actually there are things that you can do as people and as an organization to reduce the likelihood of harm. We can't erase it because we're human, and as I said, we're unpredictable, but there are things that you can do to reduce that harm. And it's not going to be found in a 1 hour unconscious bias session. It is going to be found in that deeper work. And organizations that I work with, I usually work with them for 6 months or more, because you can, as the person leading it, I can get to know them as people, I can get to know their organization, and so that positions me as someone who can really guide them. Because
Mm.
as much as there are fundamental things that we can change, actually every organization, every leader is different. And so if we really want to align this work with our values and our mission and what we're trying to achieve as an organization, it does take time. And we have to be prepared to put those resources in, both as time, energy, money, all of those things. And what I would love is for us to get to a place where we don't need something big and harmful to happen before we say, yeah, let's do this work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I fully agree with that statement. Um, and I guess as you were saying that, I was kind of thinking that actually it is it is a commitment, isn't it, to certainly through an organizational lens, for an organization to come to the decision that actually we recognize A, we can do better collectively, and B, we are willing to prioritize this. Like that is because I can understand in some of the conversations that I have with leaders and guess individuals just generally, like everybody wants to have the conversation about this, and then it's like, okay, how are you going to implement something to change this, to bring this about? What are you prepared to do? And that tends to be thing where things get a bit rocky and a bit kind of like, oh, it's on the agenda. Okay, where?
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think people don't see the links between things, do they? They don't see how doing this work actually helps with productivity. It actually helps with retention of staff. It helps with all aspects of it. I mean, if you're running your own business, it helps you attract diversity in clients. And in that moment, if you have diversity, whether it's in your clients and your teams, you've actually got much more creativity. Your ability to problem solve increases. And I think if people start to see those links and actually think, well, we can spend 6 months, a year doing this work and we can reap the benefits, not just in kind of harm and reducing harm, but as an organization as well. And I think you were saying earlier that, the journey, every step you take, you just see it gets better and better. Like you see the impact of it. And it then just becomes, it becomes part of who you are. It
Mm.
becomes part of your organization's values and culture, not this add-on that you do once or twice a year. It actually feeds into all of that. And I think if you're an organization that has that, you attract like-minded people. Like people see what you stand for, and it repels the people who aren't aligned with your mission, that probably wouldn't be successful with you if you did hire them and bring them into your world. But it also attracts the people who are like, yeah, let's do this, let's get this done, and they're aligned with what you're trying to achieve. And I just think it benefits everybody.
Mm.
And I think that again is something that's overlooked, and it's really important to see that
Mm.
it has individual benefits, but it also has collective and organizational benefits as well.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, like, can you imagine the the power it can have within an organization, that if your employees can get to grips with having what could be argued as being such complicated and complex conversations, such as race, racism, collectively, all of a sudden, when Katie needs to go and ask Kath questions about accounts, that's not a difficult conversation, is it? If we're really equipping people, if we can have the most uncomfortable conversations and do the most uncomfortable work for ourselves, other business conversations, you know, especially in the people space, become, the framework applies and they become so much more doable, really, because actually we've done that was something we got to grips with. This seems to work well.
Yeah, 100%. I think that, there aren't many conversations that are more emotive or bigger than talking about race and racism.
Yeah.
And so it's all part of that same identity piece. If you can go into that, not trying to convince people, not trying to people please, but actually just having a really secure understanding of who you are and what you want to say. If we bring that to every other conversation, we can then do it from a place of compassion, and it doesn't have to be a difficult conversation. It just becomes a conversation. And I think that's that we attach so much to that word, that idea of a difficult conversation. It's like, what actually makes a conversation difficult? Because usually it's your activation that makes it difficult. It's, you're anxious about something, how something might land, or if you get it wrong, or all of those threats to ourselves, that's what makes it difficult. And so if we've done that internal work and we're a safe person for ourselves and for other people, then difficult conversations don't really exist. They're just
Yeah.
conversations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Perfect. Exactly that. I want to just ask a question as well, and if you are happy to speak to it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But you talked a bit about your own mixed heritage and kind of dealing with whiteness and blackness. Can you speak to that a little bit for people that might be kind of unsure what you mean by that?
Yeah, and so for me, it was about, so I grew up not really talking about race and racism, getting on with it, putting your head down, getting on. And actually, you can see why families bring their children up in that way. As an adult, confronting what the world looked like was really hard. And you can understand, even though, now I know I'm trying to bring my children up in a way that, we openly talk about race and racism, because I don't want them to feel that discomfort of talking about it. I want them to be the people that, can hold space and be a safe person. But for me, when my eyes were open to it, I then had this confusion almost of, I'm mixed heritage, and so I do have privilege. I do benefit from whiteness, and colorism is real. And I am, yes, I'm brown skinned, and I have proximity to whiteness that some black people don't have. And so I have to accept my privilege. I have to accept how I've upheld these systems as well, because I have. And we still continue to, it's a learning journey. And, you know, anti-racist practitioners aren't perfect. And I think that's one of the things that makes us do the work that we do. Actually, we know that it's messy work. We know that we're going to get things wrong, but we're willing to step into that and lean into that anyway. And so there was this pull of, I have to deal with my privilege. I have to understand how some of the conversations that I've had, I've caused harm as a person who has that proximity to whiteness. And then I have to acknowledge and celebrate and connect with my blackness as well, and my history. And there was so much of my history that I didn't know or understand because it's not taught in our schools. And so then it's, I want to learn about that. I want to learn about, often when we hear and see black people, it's talking about enslavement, or it's, charity videos that where we see this stereotype of what blackness is. And actually, when we commit to learning about Black history, and we commit to learning about not just about the individuals who, yes, we celebrate and we know about them, but actually the richness of the history, how things connect, those missing pages that we were taught when we were taught about ancient Egypt, and actually we weren't taught about ancient Egypt. And when my children come home, I'm like, tell me what you learn, and then let's learn more together, and I can share what I think. But I didn't have that knowledge before. I was absorbent into what we learn in our schools as history, and then getting that critical lens of, the missing pages of history are often Black history. And so what are those missing pages? How can I learn more about that? How can I start connecting those dots? And so there's the learning side of it, and then it's, who am I? Who am I and who do I want to be? And that's where kind of my liberation work comes in, because quite often as Black and brown bodied people, we're put in boxes, these expectations of conditioning of what we should be doing and the rooms that we should be in. They can be so restrictive, and they stop us from being ourselves, because we have to code switch, we have to mask, we have to be what the world expects us to be, because our brain says it's not safe to do that otherwise. And so we're programmed to keep ourselves safe, and we see it playing out in the media and across the world. There are people who are programmed who will toe the line because that is the safest thing for them to do. And so stepping out of that feels uncomfortable and it feels unsafe. And again, it comes from doing that work on the self and thinking, who am I? How do I celebrate my blackness? How do I not think of it as this deficit model that the world wants me to think, but how do I actually embrace that and position myself and my identity as someone who has, done the work on both sides now? And so, in terms of the work that I do, I get to pull my whole identity into my business because I get to do both sides. And I think that attracts people into my world that really are ready to do the work, who are really committed to that work, but also people who want to go on that journey of embracing who they are, embracing their blackness, and saying, I can navigate this system without it affecting my joy, without it affecting who I am. And I can be a safe person for me, even when things feel unsafe. And yes, particularly at the moment, secondary trauma and seeing things and hearing things, it has an effect on us. But if we have the tools to regulate ourselves, and again to try and detach ourselves from what's going on in the world, from who we are, that's where I believe that magic happens, whether it's in your leadership, in your business, in your relationships, how you parent, how you connect with people. The work spreads through everything that we do. And so that's been my journey. And as I said, it's ongoing, and things always come up all the time, and you think, where did that come from? And I've had a reaction to this. And there are some things that I don't react to because I feel like I've explored it, and I've detached myself from it, and I remember who I am. But there are things that come up that I think, oh, I've definitely had a reaction there. What was that? And what do I need to do? And so being able to share the tools that I use and how I do that for myself has been really powerful in my business. And I think whenever we run a business, it has to be aligned with who we are. If we want to create a legacy that lives on after us, we have to know who we are so that we can tap into that when we build it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing all of that, because I think it's really important, to understand kind of the insight, but also that duality of who you are. And it comes back to that piece around, like, our identities are made up and shaped by so many different things.
Yeah.
And doing the work to understand how that all comes together and how that shows up for us, I think, is really important. So thank you for sharing that. There's a couple of things that you said in there that I just want to come back to. So we mentioned a couple of times proximity to whiteness. Can you just explain what that means?
Yeah, so when I talk about proximity to whiteness, if you look white, if you're white-bodied and you're close to that, so that proximity to whiteness is quite small, the more privilege you have. The more privilege you have when you walk into rooms, um, when you apply for jobs, yeah, all of those things. And it's a spectrum. So for me, as a mixed heritage person, I do benefit from whiteness because my skin isn't as dark as some black and brown bodied people. And so I do benefit. There are things that I get that someone who has darker skin than me will not have that proximity to that privilege. And so I think that it's really important that we acknowledge that, and that we acknowledge that wherever you fall in that spectrum, it affects your lived experience. It's the black and brown bodied experience isn't linear. It's not, if you understand one, you understand them all. It's about having that lens of, as an able-bodied person, I hold privilege. And, what does that look like when I step into a room? And it's that the assumptions that people make about us when we put ourselves out there that show that proximity to whiteness, to the Eurocentric ideals of what you should look like, how you should behave, the words that you use, what you believe in. And I think that the closer we are to that, the more we benefit from privilege. And I think it's important to acknowledge that privilege looks different. And as you go through the spectrum, that proximity, it changes your privilege. And what we as a black and brown bodied person, when I enter a space, I want to feel that someone understands that people have done the work so that they recognize that my experience walking into that room will look different to a white-bodied person, and will also look different to someone who has darker skin than me. So yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And just to kind of echo and add to that as well, is that I certainly know in the work that I do, when I walk into rooms as a white-bodied person, generally I'm working with leadership teams who are also all white-bodied people. And I find that interesting in the things that people will openly share with me, um, that I can only imagine they likely wouldn't share with anybody that wasn't a white body person, because there is this assumption of, like, I guess it's back to the safety thing, isn't it? But there's this just assumption that, oh, you'll get it, or you won't be offended, or I can say this to you. And on the one hand, that's very helpful in the work, because at least I can understand exactly how people are thinking and feeling and what approach they're kind of bringing as they come into it. And also recognizing that even though I might be offended by things that are said, it doesn't necessarily directly cause me harm, because I'm not racialized as black and brown, and therefore I'm not carrying that within me to feel that the same reaction, and it's not harm in the same way. And also then acknowledging that there is someone else's stuff in that, and the assumption that I'm just going to be okay with them sharing all of this, and that's something to be unpacked, which is interesting as well to just notice.
Yeah, it's that
Yeah,
assumption of safety, isn't it? We often
yeah,
assume that people who look like us are safer, and we will migrate to people like them, and we will be more open with them.
yeah,
Um, and I think it's something that we definitely need to acknowledge and accept in spaces, particularly all white spaces, because, you know, if as a black or brown body person, if I walked into that space, you know, it's exactly what you said. You do need to be honest about your thoughts, your feelings, your experiences. You can't filter yourself because I'm black or brown because you're worried about harming me or you're worried about offending me or getting it wrong. Actually, again, that's the barrier to the work. So yes,
yeah,
you do hold that kind of privilege in terms of, you know, people will open up. But
yeah,
what I think is that it's my job as a black person to come into those spaces and to show that I'm detached from their experiences.
yeah.
So I obviously encourage people to think about the harm that they cause, and if they hold those beliefs and they're doing it in a discriminatory way, then of course that will need to be dealt with. But quite often, actually, where that grey area is they don't want to talk about something that happened previously where there was racism because they don't want to offend me. And so actually it's about, you know, how do we open those lines of communication from the very beginning? How do we show that, you know, in this space we can talk about those things. We can put things out on onto the table so that we can deal with them, so that we can learn from them. Whether it's you that caused harm or you that witnessed harm, it's important that we have those conversations, particularly in an all white leadership team, because the more we have those conversations, the more we know how to deal with it if it comes up again. And it might not happen in exactly the same way, but actually there will be things from that that you can take into the conversations that you have, how you run meetings that actually hear all voices and don't just have one or two dominant people who are speaking over each other all the time. You know, it's those things that and those micro moments that change the culture rather than just, yeah, those big add-ons, because you haven't actually delved into the proper work.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And something else you spoke there as well about history, which I thought was fascinating, because history, I have a good friend, Kay Jones, the historian, and she is always looking at the unrepresented history, basically of people who aren't white men. And it's history is written, and we're talking about history kind of capital H. History is written through the lenses of either, you know, the successful party, you know, or the dominant group.
Mm.
Like, it's always written through a perspective. It is not the complete encapsulation of eras that have gone before, kind of time that has passed. And it's kind of that difference is between capital H history and lowercase history. And
Yes,
how are
absolutely.
we learning about all of that? And I think there is so much to be challenged in there. And I always recall an example of a friend of mine who, so she is a black woman, her child is a black child, he's a black kid, and he came home from school with homework asking him to document the pros and cons of slavery. And I mean, it was just heartbreaking, horrifying, on every level. I mean, I had a reaction to that, and that, you know, it didn't impact me. And then all I could think was, how many parents' children have received that homework and haven't noticed, haven't stopped to think, this is deeply problematic. We should probably report this to the school as something we shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
Um, and then how many, yeah, black and brown people have also had that coming into their home, and they haven't felt that they can challenge it, and they're, you know, they've had to have conversations in the confines of their own home to unpack that, manage that, and all of that. And no learning has come out of it. And it, I mean, I was horrified, but then I thought, well, it's also, it's not, it can't be a one-off, can it? That's in an education system somewhere.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it's a system, and it's heartbreaking, but it's unsurprising because of course if you don't have people that actually understand Black history, if you don't have people who are safe, who have done that work to understand what a lived experience of being a Black and brown bodied person looks like, then of course they're going to make decisions about, you know, pros and cons of enslavement. I mean, you know, how many children across the world are sitting in classrooms where enslavement is being spoken about, and it's done without any sensitivity. So the internalization of where you fit in society and in the world and your worth as a person is being infiltrated into our kids in their classrooms without the empowerment, without the, the pride of, do you know where enslavement started, everybody? And, what the riches and the amazing things were that actually, you know, black and brown body people can really celebrate and focus on. This it's so often missed. And when I talk to my kids about enslavement, it's like, that's not our history. It's not actually our history, enslavement. It happened to us, but it wasn't our history. Yes, there are parts of, the escape that are parts of our history, but actually, as a general rule, it's not ours. It's not ours. And so it always breaks my heart to think that there are children in our classrooms across the country, across the world, who are internalizing that racism and seeing that, and sometimes sitting in a classroom as the only black and brown bodied person. And as an adult, I have been in training sessions where the statistics of black and brown bodied people were put up at the start of an inclusion training to say, black and brown bodied people have this disadvantage. And essentially, the first 20 minutes was spent saying how terrible it was to be a black person. And, I was like, this is not okay. This is not how you speak about inclusion. That yes, there are statistics that do need bringing to the forefront, because it's important that we see that the impact of racism is very, very real. But actually, if we want to be part of the solution, we can't sit in a room declaring things and internalizing racism in other people without that acknowledgement of there is so much that's brilliant about being black. There is so much to celebrate and to be proud of. And most of the things that might make you internalize that racism, it's not yours. It's not yours to carry, and you don't have to carry that. And I think it's just so overlooked, and so much harm is done in those spaces, both as for children and for adults who are walking into those spaces. I think people who haven't done that work think that they're doing something good. They have good intentions, but they still cause harm. And there's often not an avenue to share that harm. And I celebrate that the parents are able to contact the school in that situation and actually say, this is not okay, because it's hard for children to speak up for themselves. It's hard for them to feel that something, and they'll have that feeling that something isn't quite right, but they might not be able to articulate it. And it's not their job to articulate it. There's adults in that room that need to know better and do better.
Quite. That was my thing. I'm like, we're asking children to advocate for themselves on topics they shouldn't have to be advocating for themselves for, because they are children, and like you say, the adults know better. And all the responsibility sits in the wrong place. And yeah. And back to your point about celebrating blackness, and again, you said this up front as well around the shame of, if we're a white person trying to celebrate the fact that we love our own country, we have this tightrope, I guess, we're walking between celebrating, and it's hard because again, we talk about Britishness as if it's an exclusively white thing, and it certainly is not. But we kind of lump everything in, don't we? And kind of like, well, if you're doing this thing, you're automatically racist. If you're a patriot, you're racist. And it's kind of like, well, this is such a mucky situation. But actually, if we all learned to make peace with who we were, we could celebrate the things about our identity and about all of our cultural histories, and acknowledging the things that we don't like about our cultural histories, honestly, because that would be okay. Like, we could take the desirable with the less desirable. Like, we could see it for what it is, and just pick the bits that we think these are the excellent bits, and I'm proud of all of this.
And it's about the bits of our culture. So if we're thinking about whiteness, celebrating whiteness to the detriment of others is the unsafe thing. It's that comparison, it's the hierarchy, it's the supremacy of it. People who are actually celebrating their whiteness and who are empowered by their whiteness don't do that. It's not about being better than, it's about knowing that you as an individual can make a difference, that actually you don't need to overpower or control or condemn another race to be secure in your own. And I think that's where, because we have a lot of whiteness celebrated, but it's without that lens. It's without that idea of, it being me, about my identity, who I am and what I'm here for. And so often it gets put into this group of, and it gets politicized as well, doesn't it? It's
Totally.
not just about your whiteness, it's about what that represents, it's about who that represents. And so, once we start going down that journey, that's not an empowerment of your whiteness and your identity. That is upholding the system. And it's knowing and understanding the difference and doing the work so that yes, you can feel empowered by your whiteness, but for good, not for, at the detriment of other people.
Absolutely. And just as well to pick up on one more piece of terminology that you used a little while ago now, because we've been going all over the place, but you talked about code switching. So can you also just explain what that is, please?
It's the idea that we walk into spaces and we have to do something different. So we change our tone. We we change how we dress, how we present, how we behave, how we react, because reacting as our full selves has been either shown through our lived experience to not be safe, or through the beliefs that we've been brought up with that have kind of come down ancestrally. And I think many people code switch to some extent. As women, if you're walking into, if, as a woman, you walk into a room full of men and you code switch, you behave in a slightly different way to be more accepted, to be more palatable, so that you don't get the oh, you don't know what you're talking about, or those questions about your ability, your professionalism. And as Black people, that code switching protects us from attack in lots of places, in lots of ways. That idea that I have to filter what I say because otherwise I might be accused of being the angry Black woman. That is how that mask comes, that filter comes, and it comes from a place of staying safe. And sometimes we do have to show that we can adhere, because it is a case of safety. Sometimes that can become very unsafe if we don't conform to what people expect for us. But what I want is that empowerment to, it's not true of every situation, but how do we show up in these situations that might feel unsafe or have the potential to be unsafe, but still be able to be ourselves? What work do we need to do outside of that before we step into that room and while we're in there to navigate that? But what can we do as individuals? And there are things we have that toolkit of being able to find that confidence within ourselves, even when the space doesn't empower us to be that way. And I think, code switching is something that, although it happens with different groups, it's so layered. And then we get the intersectionality of things, and we could do a whole nother podcast on that. But all these different layers, as a woman, as a Black woman, if we have a disability, all of those things mean that we have so many expectations that we are to conform with in order to stay safe. And we're programmed through history to stay safe. And so sometimes when things feel like a threat, we then go back into that programming of survival mode. And it's how do we make sure that we spend more time out of survival mode than we do in it? And sometimes that's about the rooms that we enter, but sometimes that's about the safety in ourselves as well. How can we bring that to ourselves even when it's not there outwardly?
Perfect. Perfect. Well, Cath, thank you. It has been a delight to have this conversation. Now, I know that there will be, I mean, my brain is always buzzing from a conversation with you, and I think you have shared so much insight, so much valuable information that I can just imagine there may be questions, there may be people that want to follow up and learn more from you. How can people get in touch with you and work with you? Because clearly they're going to want to.
Yeah, so thank you. I am on LinkedIn, Cath Blayney. I'm also on Instagram at Cath Blayney. My business is called Inclusive Leadership Coaching, so you can catch me via email, kath@inclusiveleadershipcoaching.co.uk. But yeah, really happy to answer any questions and just hear takeaways and reflections. I love that. So, we've been chatting for a while, and it's always really interesting to hear the bits that have really landed with people. So yeah, would love to start some conversations there. Just drop me a message, and yeah, happy to chat.
Absolutely. And in true signature style, I do want to end with my final question, which
Mm.
is there anything that you came to say that you haven't had an opportunity to say?
Oh yes, there was one thing. I just really wanted to celebrate your openness when I dropped into your DMs, and it can be quite confronting. And I think that it shows, the work that you do is about inclusion. And I think that yes, we're open to learning all the time, and we say that, but just the fact that you walked that walk, I think is something that is really important to acknowledge. And yeah, excited that it's brought us here, and yeah, to see what happens next in the journey.
Thank you. And likewise, I'm truly grateful that you did take that step to challenge me, and it was gratefully received. Even though, like you say, confronting, because there's always that, again, we get that response, don't we? Like, oh my God, what have I done wrong? And that's okay. That was mine to work through, but I'm pleased you did it. And I'm so delighted that it led us here to this conversation, and hopefully many, many more.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cath Blayney, thank you for coming on the Speaking of Inclusion podcast.